President Ismail Gwali in Djibouti regularly cheats the election and has an awful record for torture and for abuse of his citizens. Nobody says anything because America needs the military base. Same thing with Botswana. Botswana votes for you in the UN. Well, let their sins of election be swept under the carpet.
Coming up on British Thought Leaders, veteran journalist Geoff Hill talks about elections in Africa and why making them free and fair is in the interests of the West.
Because Islamic State's message in Tanzania and in Mozambique is that you can't bring about change through the ballot box. And Frelimo has given truth to that claim because people have voted for the opposition and then found, well, we've still got the same people in power.
After 50 years of reporting on Africa, Geoff is optimistic.
For democracy, it is moving in the right direction. The press has never been more free in Africa than it is now. There's a lot of improvement that could be made, but it's much better than where it was, say, 30, 40 years ago. And we've got to keep it moving in that direction.
Welcome to British Thought Leaders. I'm Lee Hall. Today I'm sitting down with Geoff Hill, Zimbabwean author and chief Africa correspondent of the Washington Times and the Spectator. Geoff, thanks for coming in.
Lee, what a delight to be back here.
So today we're talking about elections in Africa, starting with Botswana last month. Since independence from Britain in 1966, every 5 years the same party has won the election in Botswana. And suddenly last month a big and momentous surprise happened. You were there. What happened?
So yes, you're quite right. The Botswana Democratic Party has always won. It's been peaceful. It's the only country in Africa that's never had a coup or a period of authoritarian rule. So it's a good news story, but it's always the same party won. And this year, the opposition leader was a guy, Harvard lawyer called Duma Boko. Very bright, speaks beautifully. And he assembled thousands of volunteers to man the election booths to make sure that the voting boxes were never out of sight for a minute, right through to the counting process, through to where the results were announced. The ruling party won 4 seats out of 61. Duma Boko won a majority. That seems to have been the trick.
So that's kind of suggesting that in the past maybe things weren't quite kosher with the elections before.
There's never been any evidence of that, but it did seem quite surprising that the same party, particularly in a country that's got high unemployment, the same party came back time and time again. Botswana's advantage is that they always vote with the NATO countries, with the US, the UK, Europe, at the UN.
Right.
So in all the motions against Russia over Ukraine, Botswana always votes with the West. And as a result, the Western allies rarely question election results in Botswana. So they have got if they have cheated, they've got away with it in the past. Duma Boko was very clear to make sure that this wasn't going to happen again, and he is now the president.
So you spent a fair bit of time with him when you were over there, and you kind of had some knowledge of this plan to change the result of the election. I mean, that seems exciting, but maybe slightly risky at the same time.
I don't think it was risky. It was risky if he didn't keep it secret to the end, because then the government might have found some way to counter it, or the ruling party may have found some way to counter it. So he told me about it, but in nearly half a century as a journalist, I have never broken the law of off the record, and I promised not to repeat it, and I didn't. And he carried it out, and he won. But he is very charismatic. The president didn't do a lot of campaigning. I think the ruling party took it for granted that, well, the same order will prevail, and of course it didn't. But to his credit, Mokgweetsi Masisi, the incumbent, handed over very peacefully. There was no protest. He didn't try to hang on to power, as happens sometimes in Africa. He accepted the result, and he's going to go quietly out and leave office. So you have to salute him as well. It's good to have somebody coming in and winning an election, but you know this has happened in Zimbabwe before, where the opposition has won elections and the late Robert Mugabe simply wouldn't move. So it's important that both sides play fair.
Right up until the election, the Western analysts didn't call it at all. I mean, why didn't they see this coming?
There was just nobody watching the election. This was the amazing thing. There was nobody watching. Even in Mozambique, there wasn't a lot. There weren't a great number of observers. There were Commonwealth observers there, but very few journalists who took an interest. South Africa, huge presence when there's an election. There was an election in May. US, UK, Kenya. But for these smaller countries, in terms of population, they do tend to be ignored. I think it's also, Lee, a symptom of the fact that gathering news on the ground has become frightfully expensive, especially for TV news. Taking a camera crew halfway across the world into another country, yes, it's a very expensive process, even from Johannesburg, to take a crew next door. So people tend to cover it just from Reuters. Nothing wrong with Reuters, but you end up all using the same news outlet rather than being on the ground. Whereas, as you say, I was able to spend time with Duma beforehand, with President Boko, as he is now. And I did get a good insight to it. And I think he'll be good for the country. I was impressed. If he sticks to his plans, I was impressed with the way he's laid out solving youth unemployment, solving the falling price of diamonds, which is a major part of their GDP.
Can you tell us a bit about some of the challenges he faces? I know that diamonds one's quite a big one.
The diamonds are very big, particularly given that the majority of their exports are diamonds, and most of those diamonds are controlled by the De Beers Company, which is owned by Anglo-American. Earlier this year, the Australian BHP tried to buy Anglo-American. Anglo refused, declined the offer, $49 billion US, and then decided to sell off some of its assets to bring cash into the company. So Anglo is selling off De Beers. So the problem is, in 2018, 2% of engagement rings in the US carried a factory-made diamond, which are now identical to the real thing. This year, it's close to 50% and rising. So the price of diamonds has crashed, and that means that Anglo is going to have a hard time selling De Beers. One of the worries in the region is, what if it gets sold to Iran or to Russia or to China, who would then control the economy of this flourishing democracy? I don't know that Anglo would necessarily do that, but so far there are no buyers at the door, so they'd be hard-pressed to turn down an offer, even if it came from perhaps not the best buyer.
Another challenge was the power that is used there. I think the new president wants to use coal power, right?
Yes, well, Botswana has lots of coal. It's high-quality coal. It's a high-grade coal. They are able to produce most of their electricity, and that's the same in South Africa, Zimbabwe. When you have a lot of people who are unemployed, when you have 6 or 7 young people living in a shack who don't have jobs, trust me, they don't lie awake at night worrying how the weather might be 50 years from now. So climate change, and this is not a denial of climate change, I'm right on board with climate change, but it's not a political issue in places like Africa, even India. It's not an issue that brings votes to the table. So the cheapest way to generate electricity is coal. He's going to try and do it cleanly, but he is not going to surrender Botswana's hard-won electrical grid, which is among the best in Africa, by flipping on to some expensive way of generating power when he's got plenty of coal in the ground.
So what message do you think this election win sends to the people of Botswana?
So the big thing to look at is the median age of Botswana, which is 23. In the UK, the US, Australia, it hovers between 40 and 42. So it's a very youthful population. And you asked what the challenges are, Lee. The great difficulty is, will he be able to generate the jobs for the hundreds of thousands of people who are out of work? Yes, it's great that they've got so much of the world diamond trade, but there isn't much else. So he wants to diversify the economy. And I think it's up to Britain and Australia and America and the great democracies to try and help Botswana to diversify. Don't just give aid. Make sure that we're helping to expand the economy and to grow it away just from diamonds.
So there was also an election last month in Mozambique, which was quite a different story from this one. And can you talk a bit about that?
Very different story. It was early October. Frelimo, the ruling party, which took over from Portugal when Portugal gave the country independence 50 years ago almost, Frelimo wins the election every 5 years. For the first 20 years of independence, there was only one party, and that was Frelimo. But they cheat clumsily, It's not a good process. It's not a transparent process. Observers sent to monitor the election get locked up quite frequently. And so this time, I'm told by people on the ground, and I don't know, but I'm told that they'd have been lucky to get 30% Frelimo. They claim 70% of the vote. And it has led to riots up and down the country, not helped by the fact that Islamic State are waging a war in the north of the country. Mozambique is long and thin like Vietnam. The south of the country is Catholic. The north of the country is Muslim, a legacy of 800 years of the Arab slave trade. And it is in the north that Islamic State are trying to establish a caliphate. And there's a civil war underway. So when you have the army taken off what they should be doing, which is keeping Islamic State in check, being used by the government to restore order because your own citizens are rioting, I suspect that's a dangerous situation where Islamic State could move very quickly south and take large areas of land. That is just one scenario, but it's certainly one to watch.
Do you think what's happened with this election is bolstering the message of Islamic State somehow?
Very much so, because Islamic State's message in Tanzania and in Mozambique is that you can't bring about change through the ballot box. And Frelimo has given truth to that claim. Because people have voted for the opposition and then found, well, we've still got the same people in power. There is a new president who is waiting to take over. As in the US, the Mozambique president can only serve 2 terms. 2 terms of 5 years each. And the current president is about to go out. He had a new, younger man, Daniel Chapo, to take over. Whether Mr. Chapo will take that position is questionable. But it's a very difficult situation that shows no sign of being resolved.
Do you think there's some justification for Western involvement in that situation?
It's like Ukraine. Everybody wants to give weapons to Ukraine and money and hope they win the war. Everybody wants Mozambique to win the war against Islamic State. But nobody wants to put boots on the ground. The Americans, South Africans, Rwanda's got a small force there, but Rwanda has a very small army. It's a very small country. So Mozambique perhaps needs outside help. I don't see anybody coming to take on yet another war, particularly after you remember the chaotic withdrawal from Kabul in the early days of the Biden administration. Nobody wants to see a repeat of that if it doesn't work and if the West doesn't prevail.
So it seems with election cheating in African countries, the West is happy with it to happen over here, not happy with it happening in this country over here. And a great example of the two is Zimbabwe last year, Angola in 2022. Could you talk us through the examples?
Well, as you know, Lee, I'm originally from Zimbabwe, and so I would like to see a free and fair election in Zimbabwe, regardless of who wins. I'd like to see the press opened up and to have more diversity. But yes, there are complaints about Zimbabwe, but not Angola, because the West, America particularly, spent a long time wooing Angola away from the former Soviet Union. For the first 20 or so years of its independent history, it was a Soviet satellite, as was Mozambique. And you don't want them going back into the Moscow camp. So when they cheated their election, and it was so clumsily done and so badly done and so obviously cheated, the rigging was so in your face. Nobody wanted to say anything in case Angola went scampering back to Moscow. And as you know, Joe Biden is planning to go and visit there. He wants to see a new railway built out to Angola to bring out cobalt from the Congo, a very expensive railway. But the people of Angola are not being served well when you don't allow them to elect their own government. And as in Mozambique, it opens the way to problems in the future and potentially to civil war.
So how should we understand the West's reasons for allowing cheating to happen here but not here? Is it completely to do with political influence?
It's to do with how much America wants a country. Like Djibouti, for example, on the Horn of Africa. The US has a military base there. Their only military base, permanent military base in Africa. So does the French Foreign Legion. And so when President Ismail Gwali in Djibouti regularly cheats the election and has an awful record for torture and for abuse of his citizens, nobody says anything because America needs the military base. Same thing with Botswana. Botswana votes for you in the UN. Well, let their sins of election be swept under the carpet. South Africa, a bit more difficult. The South African elections are free and fair, but of course resulted in a hung parliament. We now have an untidy coalition of 11 parties trying desperately to hold together. The ruling African National Congress, former ruling African National Congress of Nelson Mandela, has strong ties to Russia. The opposition supports Ukraine. This could be enough to actually split the coalition in South Africa. I don't think that America or Britain really knows what to do there. And probably the answer is just to leave the South Africans to sort it out themselves.
Is the size of South Africa's economy kind of part of this as well and makes them get more focus?
That's exactly what it is. Johannesburg alone, the biggest industrial hub, Pretoria is the capital, but Johannesburg, the main commercial hub, has a GDP. The city has GDP bigger than all South Africa's neighbors combined, bigger than the national GDP of all the countries bordering South Africa combined. This is an enormous economy. And so there's a lot to lose. And yes, it is one of America, the US, is one of South Africa's biggest trading partners. South Africa's major export used to be gold. These days it's cars. It's cars, Japanese and American cars, assembled in South Africa and then exported. Much cheaper labor costs than doing it in Europe or the US. And so yes, it's an important economic partner. But also South Africa tends to see itself as as Australia does in the Pacific, as the regional superpower, and wants to be allowed, if you like, to not to dominate, but certainly to crack the whip on its neighbors, and to be seen as the leading power in the region. So they don't like too much interference from outside.
You mentioned Angola and Biden's interest in visiting there, and this railway, which I think is the biggest rail investment in Africa the US has ever done, if they do it over $1 billion. I mean, why is this country that doesn't have that much interest to US interests getting this kind of focus?
It's madness, really. It's crazy, because the better rail option goes through Botswana. It comes south from the Congo, through Zambia, through Botswana, and out to Namibia in the west. That would be a new railway line, a bit more expensive. But the capital of Botswana, Gaborone, is only 12 miles away from the border of South Africa. And as we've just said, you have this economic hub of Johannesburg, another 300 miles away. If you could pull in some of South Africa's exports, you would pay off the line through Botswana much quicker than a dedicated line between the Congo and Angola, which is going to bring out cobalt and maybe some gold and other gems from the Congo. But it will take decades to pay off the line. You could have a line coming from the Congo, joining up with the one through Botswana and Namibia and into South Africa, and pay it off so much quicker because of South African cargo going there. But it seems to be a blind spot for President Biden. He is now outgoing. We'll have to see what the new president does.
Some analysts are saying the reason Biden wants to do this is to challenge the dominance of Russia and China in the region. How does this influence of Russia and China work in Africa?
Well, if the Chinese have got endless amounts of money to lend, not to give, America and Britain tend to give money. The Chinese and the Russians tend to lend it and want it back. So if they build a railway line, they're suddenly controlling how these commodities go out of the country, and maybe to whom they are sold. And if you think South Africa has 70% of the world's platinum, yes, you'd be concerned. And that, by the way, is another of Anglo-Americans' assets that they're selling, is the platinum field in South Africa, which itself controls about 40% of world platinum, the Anglo-platinum. If that was to end up in the hands of the Russians, this is a crucial mineral. But yes, this is something the Americans do need to counter, and the British do need to counter. And Russia or China could buy that platinum field very quickly, as they could buy De Beers. And I think we need to try and get Western governments to encourage African countries to rather pool their resources with Western companies, with private companies, rather than getting them into bed with governments that may have ulterior motives.
We've seen a lot of talk about BRICS, with the S on BRICS being South Africa.
Yes.
Do you think other African countries see that as a risk?
No, because they're all queuing up to join it, and it really is going nowhere. for all the optimism of BRICS, as you say, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, it's really a replay of the non-aligned movement. It's the same membership. It's the same idea that we're going to break away from America. We're going to break the dominance of the US dollar. The US is one of the biggest trade partners for a lot of African countries. You're not going to break. Why would you want to break that? They're good payers. They're good importers. We buy lots from them as well. We buy all our TV programs from them. We don't buy TV programs from China or from Russia. First of all, they're not in English. So why would you want to break American influence in Africa? Maybe you want to spread it out a bit and have some rivalry from China and Russia, of course, and from Malaysia, Indonesia, Brazil. But America has not been a bad player in Africa. So the BRICS idea, I don't think it's ever going to work, it's ever going to fly. If you apply for a visa to most African countries, even now, they want to be paid in US dollars for the visa. I can't see that changing.
So you've been reporting on Africa for nearly 50 years now. And in terms of free and fair elections, do you think things are going in the right direction? Are you feeling optimistic?
Yes, I do. We've got Namibia coming up on the 27th of November. We've got Ghana coming up in December. Both have a history of free and fair elections. The ruling party in Namibia, SWAPO, again, long time in power, is a bit on the skids. Ghana has had several democratic changes. Kenya has had democratic changes. Tanzania's one to watch. We've got an election coming up within the next 2 years in Tanzania. Not so sure that will be free and fair. Very difficult situation, one party in power since the 1960s. But for democracy, it is moving in the right direction. The press has never been more free in Africa than it is now. There's a lot of improvement that could be made, but it's much better than where it was, say, 30, 40 years ago. And we've got to keep it moving in that direction.
And you obviously know a lot about what's going on in different parts of Africa. I mean, what stories should we keep an eye on?
I think look at Swaziland, Eswatini as the country is known, Swaziland, the last country in Africa to maintain full diplomatic ties with Taiwan, or officially the Republic of China. And the PRC, the People's Republic, is spending endless sums to try and woo Swaziland away from its links with Taiwan. That is certainly one to watch. And I don't think the Swazis are going to give up. I think that Taiwan has invested very heavily in Swaziland and done a lot of good work there. I suspect they're going to stay. And they have trade missions up and down Africa, even in countries where they don't have embassies. Taiwan is quite a growing presence. Brazil as well. Brazil has essentially taken over the old Portuguese Empire. Angola, Mozambique, even East Timor, just north of Australia. Brazil is a major investor there. Watch the Brazilian footprint in Africa. That is growing. That's something that could compete with the US.
Geoff Hill, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.